Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We will start at the top of the hour, so hang tight. Thank you for joining. We will start the webinar in about 2 minutes. Hello, everyone. Just going to give the stragglers another 30 to 60 seconds to get in, and then we'll get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, a primer on client-side security and PCI DSS v4.0. We'll start with a few housekeeping items. Matt McGuirk, Solution Architect, Office of the CTO, will start his presentation shortly, followed by a Q&A. Ask any questions and make any comments in the Q&A and chat panel in the control panel to the right. This session will be recorded and emailed to all attendees after the webinar. If you encounter any technical issues with GoToWebinar, try to sign off and sign in again. And with that out of the way, Matt, are you ready to begin?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you to everyone in attendance today. I appreciate your time and attention. Once again, my name is Matt McGuirk. I am a solution architect here at Source Defense. I've been with Source Defense for over 4 years now, and before that, I spent about 20 years knocking around in web application development, security, and related matters. So I'm really happy to be able to share whatever expertise I do have with you. We have a variety of folks in attendance today, from compliance, QSAs, from security, different practices, different techniques and ideas, and we welcome that. I want to offer, like I said, what I know about client-side security, what I know about web applications to inform your practices. And I do know a fair amount about compliance as related, but by no means do I proclaim to be an expert in all compliance matters. So really, hopefully this can be something to inform your own ideas, and I would welcome any conversation on the subject. If you want to ask a question during today's session, don't hesitate, and you'll also have my contact information afterwards. So the agenda for today, we're going to go over what we mean by client-side security. We're going to talk about how those attacks happen. We're going to talk about what is new in the version 4 of the data security standard, and specifically what applies to client-side security. And then last but not least, some approaches to both being compliant with DSS4 and to solve the security issue. So a couple quick words about who Source Defense is. Source Defense is a web application cybersecurity startup. We've been around for about 8 years in total, from inception and engineering through to today. We have developed our own patented and proprietary technology to solve this exact problem that we're discussing. Really what happened was our founders anyway, saw this concern, saw the need for something, founded the company, and then over the course of our existence, we've seen both the need as well as the regulation and legislation take off around this part of web application security, which brings us to today, where the payment card industry is actually mandating it. We are installed on a variety of different web applications, all the way from Fortune 50 companies to more modestly sized organizations, and the problem is relevant in really any type of business if they have a customer-facing or constituent-facing website. So even if we're not talking about payment cards, this is relevant in a larger sense. And we are very happy to say that our customers are happy, I suppose, not to be too flip about it, but we've found, maybe just in a more general sense, that people are really satisfied about getting their hands around this problem, especially as soon as they understand it, because to many folks it is still new. It's still a new thing that they're learning about, that they want to address. So let's talk about client-side security. What is client-side security? We're talking about web applications here, and specifically the part of a web application that runs in the web browser. So we call that the client side, meaning in contrast to part of the application that might run on the server. You may have also heard the term front end, or literally web page. So the code that runs inside a browser is made up of JavaScript. That's what everything in a web page is that's interactive. There are basically two kinds of that. First-party JavaScript, that would be something that an organization writes themselves. And I'm going to start saying the words Nike.com in here just because it's easy to say, but I'm not making any claims about the Nike organization. So Nike is going to write a bunch of code to do things like, show you a shoe configurator, so you can pick what kind of leather you want on your shoes, do their shopping cart, so on and so forth. That's first-party code that their devs or their contracted developers will build. You also have third-party code, which are things like social media integrations, analytics tools, maybe telemetry stuff. There's just a huge swath of really business online that's dedicated to providing these integrations into web pages to drive business goals. And those are essential. You're going to find on any given website that's customer facing, usually 15, 30, 45 of these different things. They all contribute to the business goals of the website, and they all introduce compliance and security risk. And so let's talk about specifically how that happens. You have here in this diagram of how a client-side attack happens. In the middle here is a web browser. That web browser is going to connect to a web server. So the visitor types in Nike.com, and then the server responds with content, basically text and images and so on and so forth, the stuff that the browser is going to turn into the experience that the visitor has while they're navigating across the site. Along the way, you've got what I would call traditional web security tools and practices, things like a firewall, maybe a web application firewall, TLS, SSL, other things. And so, as we talk about maybe the domains of payment card security overall, you probably are thinking of point of sale stuff where you don't want a credit card skimmer on the keypad. You also have things like information at rest, so databases and that sort of thing, and a variety of other concerns as well. This is what we're discussing today, really another environment that needs to be secured because it's where payment card data really is entered, usually initially. So as the page is loading, the web page is also going to pull in a bunch of code from other parts of the internet. So these are those third-party integrations that I was discussing. The browser will literally, on behalf of Nike's web page, go and grab source code from these other parts of the internet and execute it. And that code will also reference its own kind of fourth and fifth and sixth party code to load into the browser. And it's important to note that this doesn't just mean kind of like libraries or snippets or helpers or something like that. We're literally talking about whole full-blown applications that our analytics tool might load to do its job. Maybe we have a customer support chat tool that's a third-party tool integrated into the web page. And we want that tool to translate something, and we want that tool to be able to send text messages. So then you might have a fourth party or a fifth party beyond that. So this makes the overall kind of execution environment, as well as the overall kind of supply chain sprawl, is a really cool word or term that I heard from Sands and just kind of adopted as my own. But supply chain sprawl, really difficult to get our hands around. Now, all of this code, first party, third party, so on, kind of slams into the browser and is executed and then turns into the living, breathing web page that we interact with. That's all, for context, that 0.2 of a second between typing in the URL and getting the web page in front of us. So all that code, irrespective of origin or purpose, where it came from or what it's supposed to do, can do whatever it wants to the web page. It can modify it. It can change the text or the images or the forms on the page. It can access whatever data it wants, and it can leverage anything else the browser can do, including making outbound connections and so on and so forth. All of that is happening by default in an unsecured and unmonitored fashion. And what that means is that this has become a very ripe environment for attackers to exploit. Because if you think about it, if I'm an attacker and I can get into the web page here, I can do whatever the browser can do, and I'm doing it outside of what I would call, like I said before, the traditional security perimeter, meaning all those tools that monitor what's going on our servers and our web app and so on and so forth are no use in this scenario because the attack is actually happening inside the browser here. So the attackers know this, and they will exploit a number of different ways to get into this supply chain. The term here is mage cart, by the way, if you've been around for a second. That is the sort of jargony security trade term for a client-side attack, or at least was initially. The very first types of these attacks, if you're interested in the historical footnote, were perpetrated against the Magento e-commerce shopping platform, and specifically the shopping cart of that platform. So you stick together a Magento and shopping cart, you get mage cart. And there, since over the past 10 years, it's kind of evolved into client-side security to better encompass everything, because it no longer is limited to Magento by any stretch of the imagination. So the attacker will compromise one of these servers out in the supply chain. Maybe they will actually compromise some part of the infrastructure, the first-party infrastructure, to get code into the browser, amongst a bunch of other techniques, but all roads lead to Rome of the browser. And then more often than not, the attacker will use their newfound access and capabilities to steal information, more often than not, passwords or credit cards. They can also manipulate the web page to basically embed their own sniffers to collect the information, or like their own social engineered sort of forms and prompts and workflows. So imagine, for instance, a web page that normally has me pay for something after I log in. The attacker may not want to bother waiting for me to log in. Perhaps they just put a big banner on the homepage that says, click here for 15% off if you enter your credit card. And then they've got a credit card number without having to rely on any native kind of behavior of the web app. So this, what should we call it? This set of circumstances, this attack scenario, which has existed, by the way, since web browsers became the web pages became interactive. It's about 30 years now. This has really hockey sticked in terms of actual active exploitation over the last 5 years or so, which has then in turn led to enhanced security standards and attention and compliance, such as we saw the amended PCI DSS 4 in March now, including requirements about what they call payment page scripts, so kind of the same term. To illustrate a little bit further that supply chain effect, this is, just an abstract of a hypothetical website, I suppose. And so this on the left would be our web page itself, calling in what I would call third parties. So that's these hollow circles here. Those are tools and tools supplied by vendors that that the company that Nike, as we're imagining, is literally paying for. So they have a contractual relationship with these other companies, Outbrain and so on, and they know who they are. However, what they may not be aware of is Outbrain leveraging their own instance, so to speak, of the Facebook Connect platform to perform their own analytics work on the pages where they're installed. So you do get this network effect where the question becomes not just can Nike inventory their own third parties, but can they maintain this exhaustive insight into all these fourth and fifth and sixth parties. It's also important to know that this isn't quite like a more traditional software supply chain problem where you could realistically inventory all the libraries and such involved in an application development exercise. But this map of relationships we see here can shift. It literally gets rebuilt. Like it happens again every page view, right? Every time I click on a link, this stuff gets refreshed. So any of it could have changed along the way. And then two, you do see cases where the actual parts of this change based on environment, really. So for instance, if I have shopped on Adidas stock, or maybe I Googled Air Jordans before I went to Nike.com, and then I went back to Google, maybe I then see an ad for those Air Jordans. So there might have been a remarketing tool added to the Nike website in the middle there on the fly because of my behavior or my geolocation or so on and so forth. So the point is that this is a shifting and changing thing. We have spoken to, folks who have become current customers, where a big part of the headache of managing this problem was playing whack-a-mole with these fourth parties and seeing new stuff show up and having to vet it and feel good about it. So I don't mean to belabor that too much, but it is an important part of it, especially as we look at compliance and understand what we need to do. There are other ways to visualize this as well. I wanted to point out some that we provide. This is what we call a risk report. It is a free thing you can get right after this phone call. There's no obligation or anything like that. And it's also passive. I want to point out it's something like a penetration test. It's just showing in an intelligible format what your website or a website is delivering to visitors and what risk that could expose them to. So I just pulled up a copy of a New York Times threat report just to be kind of generic here, showing some of the risk a visitor to the New York Times is exposed to, some of the compliance matters, and a full inventory of those things. And so the reason I show this is not to shame the New York Times. They're not doing anything different than anybody else, but just the actual, I guess, I don't want to say severity, but the complexity of the relationships that occur just when you or I, as a reader of the newspaper, go to a website, and when the New York Times media team is thinking about how to monetize and best make use of it, like what are the consequences of that? And as you can see, it becomes pretty interesting pretty quickly. So difficult to get your hands around, but not impossible by any stretch. We have seen a lot of attacks occur. There's something like, I would say there's easily tens of thousands of individual sites compromised every year via client-side attacks. There are big names along the way. And the reason I show these, again, is not to shame anybody. It's about kind of just connecting the dots. So you may have seen a bunch of these breaches in the news and other similar ones. And unfortunately, there's security stuff all the time because we live in an imperfect world. But the through line, at least in this slide, is there are big name attacks that occur against major brands. And I think, in my opinion, some of both the frequency of this and the severity of some of these attacks are why we're now seeing compliance become, basically why does compliance exist, right? So that we all follow the best practices to make things more secure. And unfortunately, this trail of damage is why we're now seeing enhanced compliance, because we got to make this stuff, we got to nip this in the bud. On to PCI. So the payment card industry, as you may be aware, has something called their data security standard. Version 4.0 was distributed in March of this year, I believe. And its new requirements will come into force over the next short to medium term. And there are two sections in particular, two requirements in particular, which touch on client-side security. So basically 6.4 and 11.6. And the meat of those are, what do we have to do on what PCI here is referring to as payment pages, and these scripts, the client-side code, the JavaScript, all that stuff's the same thing, that are executed in the browser. We need to have, if we're going to have payment pages and scripts, which we're going to have if we have a website, we have to have a method to confirm that each script is authorized. So saying that we know why this script here and we have a good purpose for it. I'm going to skip to the third bullet because it's kind of relevant. An inventory of all those scripts with written justification. So not just that someone said, yes, you can put scripts on the web pages, but that there is a written down reason for why, and an exhaustive, I don't want to say exhaustive, but complete inventory of all those scripts. So at least visibility is the first thing that we're getting at here. Secondly, we need to have a method to assure the integrity of each script. So saying that that script is doing what we intend it to do, its behavior is not started to go off script. Sorry, excuse me, I didn't mean to do that, but here we are. So really good, pretty good common sense sort of things. If you're going to run code on these pages, you should have mechanisms to control them. The next section is more or less talking about actual in the page mechanisms to make sure that nothing bad or unnecessary or illicit is happening. And I'm going to actually just take a step back. That unnecessary and kind of bad practice thing, I should underscore that. So we've talked a lot about attacks and we've talked a lot about hackers and stuff like that. It's also important to note just simple overreach by analytics plugins, by third-party vendors, by whatever. A lot of these tools, like an analytics tool, like a marketing tool, by default are very, very, very aggressive in how they collect data. And that can be a good thing, meaning that if I'm a marketer and I want a really complete ability to, follow every single thing a visitor does and see everything they type into every field and yada, yada, that can be really good in a way in that it gives me a lot of data and a lot of functionality. But that is also an extremely aggressive stance to take when it comes to visitor privacy and to due diligence with data and stuff like that. So, so the takeaway there is your tools, even if they're installed, and even if they're installed, they're acting as you expect them to, and even if they're configured properly, can collect way more data than they should. So that's another key motivation in these requirements coming to bear, and also why it's important just in general to solve this problem. So sorry about the tangent, but I wanted to make that other case pretty clear. We want to make sure that there is a change and tamper detection mechanism to basically do two things. Verify that the content of our payment pages hasn't changed, and that the HTTP response headers have not changed from a known good baseline. So again, a little bit more explanation. If you're not familiar, an HTTP response header is, if you think of a web page kind of like a letter, the web page itself is the letter inside the envelope. It's got words and stuff on it. and content, and that's what you want to look at. The headers then are kind of like the envelope itself. It's got the address on it, the return address, a postal mark, all that good stuff. So you don't really, look at that as you're reading the letter, but it was important in the delivery of the letter. That's what HTTP headers are like. They contain a bunch of information about how the browser should interpret the web page and the data that was sent over. It's important from a security standpoint to know if those headers are the same, because an attack may remove them or change them or kind of slacken the security that those headers enforce. So kind of a little bit of a technical tangent there, but that's why we're talking about HTTP headers, because the modification of those could indicate a security problem, more or less. And that those mechanisms must perform their function periodically or at least once every 7 days. So the way I read that, I think we have the bullets a little bit backwards here, is that you can't just do this once and the slowest, the least frequent period that you can enforce is 7 days, so once a week. How can we address these requirements? So there are specific pieces of guidance in DSS4 about payment page security and scripts and so on. The first that they mention is content security policy, often abbreviated as CSP, sub-resource integrity, or SRI, or proprietary technologies. They refer to the, by the way, they use the term tag management system, which is fine, it's a valid term. Tag management and the word tag are just kind of web dev jargon for JavaScript. The JavaScript's embedded by HTML tags, so that's how we get shortened to tag. Don't be confused, it's just a different way of saying the same thing. What I want to do over the next couple of minutes is just go over these technologies so you have an understanding of them, and you can understand why they're being recommended as ways to address the problem. So content security policy and sub-resource integrity are both parts of the web server, web browser specification, the general industry standard about how servers and browsers work together. So they are kind of things that a company like Nike would potentially implement themselves internally. Proprietary technologies are obviously kind of like what Source Defense does. They're security or compliance tech that has been developed to solve the problem as well. Let's talk a little bit about CSP, how it actually works. The CSP overall, the concept is that you make a list of every script that you want your visitor's web browser to load and the location of that script, and a couple pretty lightweight configurations about how it should behave. And then you put that on your web server and send it out to the browser. And then the browser reviews it and checks it. The actual practical work of that is that a person, at Nike, would have to review all of their third-party integrations, no matter how many that is, as well as the fourth and fifth party, I should say as well. If you want a complete content security policy, you need to define all the JavaScript and its locations and where it lives on the internet. You kind of deploy that to the web server, and then every time a visitor goes to your website, that browser will also receive that CSP directive, the CSP definition, and enforce it. So the enforcement looks like this. Basically, the browser will load up the CSP definitions and say, okay, here's the list of scripts I can load. The web page can then execute and attempt to load whatever scripts it wants. And it gets a little interesting there. Like, why is there a difference between the list of what we know we want to load and the list of things that will load? And it's more or less because of the fourth party issue, the fifth party issue, like I was describing before, where other code can load dynamically, or things like cross-site scripting attacks, where someone will force another piece of code to load in the web page for one reason or another. So I know, at least for me, the first time I thought about it, it was a little odd that, like, why are you defining a list of things that are going to happen? It's because the things that may happen are not always what you want to happen. So anyway, the browser compares that list to any JavaScript that intends to load, and if it is valid, then if it's contained in the list, then it is permitted. If it is not valid, if it's not contained within the list, then it's denied. The browser may not load. And so there you get a way to satisfy a few of the requirements we've talked about, basically the inventory and authorization. And if you paired this up with some kind of record keeping exercise, then you would have authorization as well. But that's the general idea. And it is, to boil it down, a whitelisting, blacklisting approach. It gives you a really fine-grained control over what external sources the browser is allowed to interact with. I mean, that's really the goal of the technology. The issues with it from an implementation standpoint, and we've had a number of folks who we've spoken with that go down the path of CSP SRI and then eventually determine that it's simply too burdensome to work with. That's the overwhelming criticism that I've heard of it, is that the activity of inventorying these things and maintaining the list and maintaining the work with all the third and fourth parties to keep all that up to date is really challenging, and that the consequence of not doing it properly is breaking all of those marketing tools. So to be clear, it won't break like the web page. It won't, cause, well, I guess it could. Actually, we did speak to, sorry, super nerd tangent, but we did speak to one set of folks who their CSP like file got so big that it broke how web browsers tried to render the web page, which is really weird, but super interesting to me if you spent half your life thinking about web servers. So difficult to maintain and kind of difficult to implement technically. Also, the approach is whitelisting. So you're saying that this URL on the internet is valid and that the browser may get code from there. However, you're really not saying anything about what that code is or what it's supposed to do or what it can do or what it can't do. So it's literally just saying this place is trusted explicitly or completely. It's also really easy to bypass content security policy. Just go ahead and Google CSP bypass and you'll see dozens of different interesting workarounds. Sub-resource integrity. Sub-resource integrity is kind of the cousin to content security policy. It is basically a cryptographic hashing technique, or to put it more simply, it's a way of fingerprinting scripts. So what you do is you take all the third-party scripts that you're going to integrate into your web pages, and you run them through some kind of system to generate a cryptographic hash, which is just some text that uniquely identifies that script and that version of that script as what it is. So basically it's a fingerprint. You then load all of those fingerprints onto the web server. And whenever someone goes to your website, they will be served the web page and the valid fingerprints, and they will be compared against what gets loaded by the web browser from the internet. So the idea is, let's compare this script that just got pulled from Google Analytics with the known good script, the known good copy of Google Analytics that we fingerprinted. If the fingerprint is valid, then the browser may execute the script. And if it is invalid, that means that there's some difference between the copy that was reviewed and the copy that was just retrieved from the vendor by the browser. That change could be the result of an attacker injecting malware into that script. It could be simply a version release based on changes by the vendor, and more commonly and more challengingly to deal with is that JavaScript changes dynamically often at the time of request. What I mean by that is, at the time the browser asks for the JavaScript file, the vendor may literally maybe react to that request by embedding a unique user ID in the JavaScript file, right? Like the server just says, oh, it's this person, great, put the thing in there, and then the code that executes in the browser knows who they are. So if the code that the browser is downloading changes at the time of the request, then it's impossible to generate a fingerprint that matches some other state. You can't know what's going to happen in the future, therefore you can't fingerprint it. So a little bit of a tangent, but important in the case of JavaScript when you're talking about some kind of hash comparison, because like everything else on the web, it changes absolutely constantly, programmatically, and therefore this kind of approach becomes a little more brittle, I guess would be a good way to put it. The advantages of sub-resource integrity. So to harken back to the compliance matters, this is what when we're talking about verifying the integrity of, you can see it's right there in the name of the technology, sub-resource integrity. This is a really good way to manage change, basically prevent changes from altering the security posture of the web page. If something's going to happen that we Nike haven't reviewed and we don't know what it's going to do, then it may not execute, literally. And because we're talking about cryptographically strong hashing, you can bring your own algorithm. You can make it as strong as you want. You could try to throw all the brute force in the world at it. You could wait till the heat death of the universe. You're not going to be able to fake a reasonably cryptographically strong scheme. So point being is that, yeah, in that sense, it works pretty well. Cryptography is good. The issue with when you're trying to apply this practically to this problem is that you may block third-party operations. So like I said, the dynamic JavaScript is an issue. Any vendor on the internet is going to, any vendor that you're providing that's providing a web service to a company is going to kind of live and die on frequent product releases and everything, and then changes to the software and updates and so on and so forth. So what you would end up with is a case where a security or administrative team at the website, at the company that wants to implement SRI, has to stay pretty much in lockstep with all their vendors to update hashes and so on and so forth, or alternately lock themselves into a particular version of whatever vendor script and take whatever administrative burden comes with that, as well as kind of ironically any inherent security risk that might come from, in effect, running unpatched software. The other thing I would mention about SRI is that if you're talking about fourth and fifth party JavaScript, think about it in a signed script that can load other scripts. You're not signing those other scripts, right? So it can kind of load uncontrolled code. And then last but not least, I'm just going to hammer it home one more time. It's the administrative burden of this stuff. It's very challenging to apply these technologies to the problem of scripts running on payment pages in the context of a modern revenue-driven website. CSP and SRI are sometimes what I call well-intentioned technologies. They're not, just bad at their heart, but they were kind of designed to solve a different problem. If I have a web application that I wrote and I need to split the code across, 10 different servers that I know where all they are, and I also control the CI/CD process, the release process for that software, then I can reasonably know where everything is, when it's going to change, and I can update that because I'm the one making all the changes. And then in that case, CSP SRI would be a pretty good way of doing all that. When you try to apply those technologies, which on their face seem like they should solve this problem, right? They're about inventorying and controlling sources, and they're about verifying integrity and managing whether or not code has changed. When you try to apply those to this problem, it kind of falls apart because the third-party ecosystem is just so challenging to manage from a code hygiene version. It doesn't fit. It's a square peg in a round hole. The third option that PCI DSS lays out is proprietary tag management systems, as they call it. Source defense is one of those. We kind of were founded with a few different ideas in mind, those being simplicity, visibility, assurance, and control. And so it's ironic after a fashion, but we're a security company, right? We were founded to solve a security problem. We have, what in my opinion anyway, really good technology that solves that, but it also lines up pretty nicely with that language that PCI has included in DSS. And so we're about giving a way to simply see what's going on in your web app, in the front end of the web app. Know that it's going to be kept up to date, our information about it, that there's going to be reasonable alerts and events and information that your team can take action on in an ongoing sense, and that once we're in place, it's going to keep working. You're assured that you've got the problem solved. And then we can go a step further and actually provide control of how code executes in the browser, and particularly those third and fourth and fifth party pieces of software. So the idea is not only can you see and know, but you can do something to control what's going on in your web pages, which lets you check those boxes that PCI is now requiring. We do this in kind of there's two different halves to the whole here. We have something called Source Defense Detect. Source Defense Detect gives us kind of either periodic scanning, like is required by part of PCI, or real-time user data about what scripts are loading, what they're doing, whether they are performing actions that are insecure or that are potentially risky, and give security and compliance teams the insight that they need to basically have a much better handle around client-side security than they could do through some kind of manual process or et cetera. And Detect is a really cool solution for those who either have a more modestly sized website or a more, modestly sized budget, to be frank, to get your feet wet and really easily check a bunch of those boxes that are required to stay compliant without having to launch a whole project involving a bunch of different teams. The second, we can go a step further than simply the visibility and the information-driven alerts. We can also provide protection. So we can be Source Defense Protect can be built into your web pages. It can control the execution of code in real time, meaning basically we sandbox third-party code and we define what it can and cannot do, and in real time filter out undesirable behaviors. So these scripts can't read from password or credit card fields, for instance, but they can do whatever else they need to do to perform their intended function. And by the way, in practice, you'd be, I mean, realistically, like 98% of the third-party integrations in the world just don't need any access to sensitive data or data altogether. And the cases where they do, we can be selective about what's shared out to those visitors. So I'm just saying, like, by getting a solution in place that really cuts this off at the root, it solves just a bunch of conceptual problems that also happen, that then solve the security and the compliance issues. So it's about that combination of insight for us, and then the proactive securing of these scripts such that they cannot cause a security problem, and then therefore also check those compliance boxes. So more of a holistic approach that I think our customers are spending something like 1 to 5 hours per month at the most, managing our solution rather than some kind of more intensive thing that would require a fair amount of manual effort. That overall, I hope, is a review of what client, or overview rather, of what client-side security is, a little bit of how it's evolved over the past 10 years into a pretty serious both domain of practice and issue of concern, matter of concern. Some of the ways that PCI is mandating protections in this space, as well as their requirements. And thank you for your patience. Also a little bit about what source defense does and how we do it. We do, you know, it's just a good practice to solve this problem. It doesn't need to be with us, but I would urge you all in attendance to get your hands around it and start thinking about it, especially as we go into the holiday season, right? Because I think there was just a report this morning, maybe we'll throw it in the chat, of something like 36% of Magento sites were infected with some kind of shopping cart Trojan over the past month. But I mean, to laugh, it's a serious thing. But this is not a this is a persistent and active sort of deal. So it's important that we learn about it. If you want to speak to us more, we can get you that risk report. Just head to our website. I believe it's sourcedefense.com/check-your-exposure. Or feel free to reach out to me personally or through the website. We can provide you a demo of anything, attack simulation against your website, underline the word simulation there. And then you can hit us up on LinkedIn or social media for further information about these webinars and other stuff we do. I'm happy to answer questions while I'm waiting for those to filter in. If anybody wants to just type those into the Q&A box. I'm going to point out that on our homepage, sourcedefense.com, we have a PCI DSS resource center. So like I said, it's kind of a big deal for us. And so we've dedicated some space here on the homepage. Click through to this and you'll get way more information than I talked about today. And I would be happy to, I urge you to take a look at that if you like, as it's probably better said than I did. Maybe, I'm not sure. So I'll pause here for a second and wait for these questions to filter in. Okay, I got a question here, which is, so is this kind of the same thing? I'm paraphrasing, sorry. Is this the same thing as an XSS attack? Would the same kind of controls handle this? And yeah, so I would say that XSS is a form of client-side attack. It depends on a lot of the same. Yes, XSS is a part of client-side security. If you were to take a look at the OWASP top 10 that was updated last year, I think this is now number 3 on the thing, and it kind of covers injection and the change of software and change control. They kind of morphed it into something slightly different. So it's definitely it's in the same realm. Also, OWASP, if anyone's curious, OWASP is the web security working group that's been around forever. They also released a client-side top 10, so 10 specific recommendations for client-side security, if anyone's curious about that. Okay, so The question, again, to paraphrase, isn't this something that's typically handled by a WAF, a web application firewall? What's the difference? I thought, kind of aren't web pages covered under that same tech? Good question. So WAFs, for anyone who's unfamiliar, a technology that's fairly recently come to light as something you really need. So WAFs are intended to protect the web application from sort of, let's call them inbound attacks. So if I'm concerned about an SQL injection, the ability to manipulate a database from the outside by abusing application logic, or even something like a DDoS, I would kind of throw into the WAF bucket at this point. Basically, outside-in attacks are what a WAF is mainly concerned with. What we're concerned with client-side security is inside out. So meaning that once our code has left the confines of our web application, so to speak, and is executing out in browser land, that there needs to be a layer of security running in that environment, in addition to securing the stuff that's inside our boundaries, so to speak. So there are related technologies, they're related problem spaces, if you will, that solve similar problems, but they don't overlap that much. It's a good question. All right, cool. I think that's what we're going to get for questions, and thank you for those. Thanks to everybody who joined today. I do appreciate your time and attention. I know you got other stuff to do, so again, I appreciate it. I'm Matthew at sourcedefense.com if you'd like to speak to me about anything, and if not, sourcedefense.com has some great resources for you as well. And thank you for attending. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.